Yes, hello everyone. My name is Martha Spees. I'm with Peace Action Maine. We're one of the co-hosts for this event, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Lily speak about her trip to Japan. Thank you.
And thank you, Martha, for helping set this up. So tonight we are going to hear from National Peace Action's Lilly Dragnev, who has just returned from the International Peace Conference in Japan, which was about 80 years later, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let's pause for a moment to acknowledge that, at least here in New Hampshire, we are doing our work on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Wabanaki, and Pennacook peoples, past and present. We honor the land and the water and those people who have been in relationship throughout many generations. Quick reminder on our Zoom guidelines and the flow of the evening. We love it when you have your video on, but we will keep audio muted to start with for everyone. You can use the chat to ask questions, and later on after the presentation there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and we'll do hand raising and people can actually speak at that point. So with that said, I do want to introduce you to our speaker. We're really thrilled to have Lilly with us. She is currently the National Engagement and Campaign Director at Peace Action, with experience in research, evaluation, and project coordination in various international organizations. She has a background in political science, anthropology, and international studies. As National Peace Action affiliates, Martha and I have the opportunity to hear from Lilly on a really regular basis, and we're really glad to give you all the chance as well, since we all get so much out of working with her. So please join me in welcoming Lilly, and we will turn it over to her next.
Thanks so much, Amy. So I'm gonna screen share because this trip definitely featured a lot of photo opportunities. So I just want to get that up for folks as well. Seeing it okay? Looking for a thumbs up. Okay, great. So thank you all for joining this call. I'm honored to be here with you all and share my experiences representing Peace Action at the 80th anniversary commemorations in Japan. So, this picture is one that I took at the museum in Hiroshima, and it was just the fragment of the room, but they did this beautiful job of laying out, the ruins and devastation. So as you walk in, it's just, right there to remind you the destructive power of what happened and what we've done. And I think, in terms of this trip, one of the things that struck me most from my time in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the resilience and hope of the Japanese people. From one of the darkest moments in human history, they built back not with anger and a desire for vengeance, but instead with hope and a desire for change. There's really this conviction to ensure that no one else in the world endures what they have survived. Japan obviously is the only country that has borne the unimaginable scars of nuclear violence, used in a war, and yet it's transformed that suffering into an unshakable beacon for peace. For instance, the Japanese people overwhelmingly believe in a nuclear weapons-free world. So the polling is around 75% in support of the United Nations Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And, I also heard time and again in all the conferences I was in, people speak proudly of the Article 9 in their constitution. So that's their no war clause. It calls for the renunciation of war. And the actual clause itself is aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of a nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. And golly, we could all use a bit more of that sort of language in our constitutions, right? And then for reference as well, I've got a map of Japan. And so, like Tokyo is kind of right in the middle area. And, if you look, Hiroshima is here, this area next to Kobe, and Nagasaki is here. So they're more toward the western parts of the country. Okay. So the conference kicked off on August 4th. We met at the Peace Memorial Park for the flower ceremony. We left flowers first on the South Korean victim monument. So that's this one with the turtle. And so to honor the South Korean victims. And then we walked to the main memorial and laid flowers there as well. And so you may already be familiar, but the death toll of the bombings was between 140 and 210,000 by the end of 1945. So that includes the ongoing radiation deaths. Estimates are that over 50,000 of those who died in the bombings were Korean, and about 43,000 or so survived the bombings. And there's still about 1,600 surviving Korea hibakusha today. And in terms of the attacks as well, around 650,000 people survived as official hibakusha, but only about 99,000 of them are still alive today. And just because it wasn't solely, Japanese and Koreans, 12 American POWs were also killed, and I'll mention some of the other nationalities later. So, we laid flowers to honor the victims as well as the survivors and their, the horrors that they've had to endure. We had 3 Japanese high school students also join us in the laying of the wreath and everything. And I was really impressed by the number of student groups that were involved in the peace community in Japan. So apparently I found out a lot of the schools in Japan take field trips to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although apparently over the past few years, that number is decreasing. So since the pandemic in particular has been trickier to get folks out to that western part of the country, especially the Nagasaki, which is a bit further out from there even. And for the trip as well, a group of South Korean students had flown out from South Korea to join us also. And it seems like they try to annually bring a small to medium large size group of students to the conference also to be involved in the various workshops where Japanese students are also there. After the ceremony, we marched to the stadium. So we did a peace march through the streets of Hiroshima. And I was in the front alongside activists from the Marshall Islands in South Korea who are also present. So that's the other 2 that are with me, as well as the chair of GENSUIKIN, the group that I was part of. And it was really strange. So we had like police escorts alongside us that were clearing the streets, and we were marching through the main streets of Hiroshima, including some of the most tourist frequented areas. So there was a lot of, attention that we were drawing to this. And, given the history of police and protesters here, it was just a little surreal to see them supporting us and in solidarity and working to help the protesters there. And so we chanted "No more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki, no more hibakusha, no more war" as we marched to the stadium. And we had about 2,000 people or so, I think was the estimate, with GENSUIKIN chapters from all across the country. So you can kind of see in these photos the various flags representing the different chapters of GENSUIKIN through the country and the different unions. And so, that was also really impressive to see the massive group of chapters. And we reached the stadium a little early, so we actually had to wait for another peace group, GENSUIKIO, to clear the venue. And then we kicked off the opening ceremony, which is where I spoke, and I think Martha is going to show some of that video a little bit later. And like I said, GENSUIKIN was the group that I was joining. This is the speech at the stadium, so a couple of photos there from my speech. So this group was established in 1965, and it was comprised of a lot of various labor unions, women's organizations, youth organizations, and civil society groups. And they have a chapter in all 47 prefectures in Japan. So, very much widespread throughout the country. It's one of the largest peace groups that they have there. They work in solidarity with the hibakusha worldwide. So, obviously the Japanese ones, but also folks in the Marshall Islands, South Korea, Netherlands, Kazakhstan, US, and other places where people have been impacted by nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. And after the Fukushima meltdown in 2011, they now hold a conference, an annual conference in Fukushima as well. And one of the things that GENSUIKIN also wants, and one area where they actually diverge from GENSUIKIO, which is another big peace group there, is that GENSUIKIN supports the phasing out of nuclear power, and they believe it should be phased out because of the disastrous consequences that a breakdown could carry. So another area, that they're working on, or one area that they've been working on because of that lately, is around the Fukushima wastewater being released into the Pacific, and obviously just warning against that move and the impacts it could have. And the other big push for them has been to get Japan to ratify the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and, lead in that effort, lead by example. So on this front, they were really excited about the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize going to Nihon Hidankyo. So that is another peace group in Japan that's primarily hibakusha focused and comprised. And so obviously the survivors, when I say hibakusha, it's the nuclear survivors, telling their stories over and over has helped keep this alive in collective memory. And so, seeing that group be rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize last year has been a great way to raise more awareness, both within the country and nationwide. So after the march, we got into the stadium, and I spoke to the GENSUIKIN group, about 2,000 or so people. And, it was really inspiring just seeing those kinds of turnouts, and this is just one of the multiple groups that was hosting events around this. So it was just really inspiring to see that. And then the other big thing was workshops throughout the time that I was there. So I spoke at a workshop alongside Mr. Akiba. It's weird calling him by his first name just because he's a former mayor. So I'm just going to call him Mr. Akiba. And he's the former mayor of Hiroshima right there. And Yoonga Lee from South Korea, the other activist, she's from People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, PSPD. And there's about 500 or so people in our workshop listening to, the work that we're doing on the global front for peace and disarmament. So I spoke about, peace actions, nuclear disarmament work in the US and the major challenges that we're facing. Mayor Akiba spoke about the need for Japan to ratify the TPNW, and Yoonga spoke about South Korea and the work that they are doing to keep the US nuclear deployments out of their country and things like that. And one scary thing that struck me about her presentation was that South Korea, the support for nuclear deterrence in South Korea has really been growing over the years, and it's about 70% or so, which is really disappointing, and frustrating because it means that they've got their work cut out for us or for them. And then another workshop that happened at the same time, so I wasn't able to attend, but obviously I had spoken to the folks from the Marshall Islands and the Netherlands throughout the conference, so I had heard about their experiences, but there was another simultaneous workshop about hibakusha from foreign countries. So Erwin van Hollen from the Netherlands spoke about his father's experience. And then Justin Kaljamor from Radiation Exposure Awareness Crusaders for Humanity, Marshall Islands, spoke about the nuclear testing there. And so one thing I didn't quite realize was that the term hibakusha for the survivors was expanded a bit over the years to encompass victims of nuclear weapons testing worldwide. So there's a group of global hibakusha now in places like Kazakhstan, Russia, Marshall Islands, the US downwinders in the American West, French Polynesia, and more. And Erwin's father was part of the Dutch Royal Army. So he was in Indonesia, which at the time was part of the Dutch East Indies. And he was in the Royal Army and was a prisoner of war in Nagasaki when the bomb was dropped. And he passed a few years back. So Erwin and his wife Corinne spoke about his experiences at this conference. And it was interesting to find out. So apparently, even though Erwin's father saw the flash when he was in the camp, he wasn't considered official hibakusha because he was beyond a number of kilometers from the hypocenter. So that term is based on which section of the drop you were in. So he saw the flash, but wasn't an official hibakusha. But, again, with this conference, obviously they want to represent these stories. So it wasn't, an issue in that sense. But in terms of like, I guess, government labels and recognition, there's some sort of distance that's used with the term. But, obviously they're still prioritizing his story. And his father was in Fukuoka 14B was the camp where he was held. And actually 7 Dutch and 1 British POW were killed by the Nagasaki bomb in that camp, but nearly 200 survived. So partly because it was a bit further away, and Erwin's father was one of them. And so he spoke about that. Meanwhile, Justin is from the Marshall Islands. He's currently in school in Hawaii, but he grew up in the Marshall Islands and spoke about the awful impact on his people's health and environment that came from the years of nuclear testing by the US. So if you're not familiar, the United States carried out 67 tests between 1946 and 1958. In the Marshall Islands, 23 were at Bikini Atoll and 44 were near, I can never say this one, he says it so much better, but Eniwetok Atoll. And obviously this led to, birth defects, health conditions, cancers, you name it, as well as obviously the environmental damage that has led to Bikini Atoll becoming essentially uninhabitable. And coconuts, one of the main staples and cultural, just important things there, becoming inedible in that area. And I don't know if folks are familiar or have seen the giant pit of radioactive waste off the shore of Bikini Atoll, but it was just covered up with concrete because someone decided that was good enough. Obviously, it's not. And so, particularly because of climate change and rising ocean levels, any time that is exposed to water and ocean and all of those things, it corrodes the concrete. And so it's very, dangerous as to what would happen if this waste were exposed to, the rest of the ocean. So unfortunately, GENSUIKIN never heard back from a Kazakh group that they reached out to. So I personally was more aware of US testing that we had done over the years, but obviously there are other nuclear nations. And so I'd never really learned as much about the impact of those until recently. And apparently between 1949 and 1989, so up until the year I was born, the USSR was conducting tests in what is now Kazakhstan. So they did 116 atmospheric above ground tests and 340 underground tests in the Semipalatinsk region of Kazakhstan. And so obviously the people there were hit with equally awful health conditions, environmental destruction, the same kinds of things that Justin spoke about. And like I said, GENSUIKIN had reached out to them, but never heard back. And so we'll see if, ideally in future conferences, they can also be represented. In Russia, so after they stopped the testing in the Kazakhstan area, they continued testing for a few more years in like the Arctic. So Novaya Zemlya area, Russia continued tests there and did particularly underground testing, including the largest ever Tsar Bomba detonation. They tested that there, but because it's slightly less inhabited, there was less victims, but obviously the indigenous communities in that area in particular, suffered a lot of health issues and environmental damage as well from that. And of course, you might be more familiar with the US downwinder community. I was more aware from them, and they also were not represented at this particular event. And I think potentially in future years, again, that's something that they're striving for. But I made a point to mention that community within my speeches as well. So again, you might know that the US did testing until 1962 in Nevada, which increased cancer rates for tens of thousands of Americans. There we go. Too far. Okay. So on August 6th, it was, 80 years later at 8:15 in the morning, exactly 80 years later. And the official government commemoration vigil was happening at that time. In the morning, the prime minister at the time gave an address at Peace Park alongside other government officials, and foreign dignitaries from all over the world had come in for this event. The United Nations had a large delegation in attendance, and I didn't see or meet them, but I heard that there was U.S. embassy workers present, but there wasn't any sort of official acknowledgement statement, anything from the White House on this day, unfortunately. My brother was actually in Bulgaria visiting some of our family at the time, and he said that it was being broadcast all over the news. So there was like a live stream of the event happening. And I heard from friends abroad too that that was the case. So it was very globally prominent. Our group didn't stay for that entire ceremony because we had other events tied to the GENSUIKIN conference. So we had a closing ceremony we had to get to. I didn't catch all of the remarks and aspects, but I got to speak again at the closing ceremony. And then that evening, and every evening on the 6th, they do a lantern ceremony. So obviously, again, this one being 80 years was I don't know if it was necessarily bigger than other years. I think the government workers and things that were there were bigger in number, but the lantern ceremony was probably just as big as any other years. But yeah, so they did that to commemorate the bombings, and there was tons of tourists who were present. So it's great that they were able to learn more about it by witnessing this ceremony. I don't know how many folks are necessarily aware of the history or the details or the extent of damage that happens from this. And this was one way to educate. And there was also a Gaza rally that was happening. And I say rally because it wasn't, necessarily protesting. It didn't seem like anybody was disagreeing with them or trying to silence them or stop them. It was just very much like, hey, this is, 80 years later, here we are. We're still at war, and there's still wars globally that we need to stop and we need to be better. And so, that was also inspiring to see that the Japanese people are keeping Gaza, Ukraine, other places close to heart and want to see an end to all wars, right? Not just nuclear war. So, there's a lot of solidarity with the global wars and ending those. Then we took the train to Nagasaki for the rest of the conference. And, again, we had workshops where I spoke. This was someone from a labor union, a woman who had asked me a question in Hiroshima, and she had also gone to Nagasaki. And so she came up and was like, "Oh, I don't know if you remember me." And I'm like, "Of course I do. You asked about Trump." So I wanted to take a picture with her, but there was a lot of focus on the future and not, I'm sure that there was probably a big group in Hiroshima as well, but we were off stage during the student presentation, so I couldn't see the size present in the Hiroshima conference, but we were on stage during the Nagasaki one, and so I was able to take a side photo from my place on stage of the student group. There was like a massive student group in attendance, with a couple of presenters talking about their time at the conference and workshops. And then, in the workshop where I spoke, in the big conference, the closing ceremony, it was about 60% first time attendees, which, across the board at all of the events, I feel like maybe between 40 and 70% of people were new, which was, again, very inspiring. There was a lot of focus on honoring the prisoners as well and confronting the Japanese legacy, and particularly in Nagasaki, because the prisoner of war camps were located there. That was a bit more of the focus. So there's statues honoring the victims from South Korea. Oh, sorry, too far. Honoring the victims from South Korea, as well as the prisoners of war. So this plaque was actually moved. It had been, I think, by the camp itself for many years, but because it's further outside the city, it wasn't as prominently displayed. And so this plaque to the prisoner of war victims was moved centrally into the park near the Peace Museum. So, really putting it in a prominent location, incorporating it into the ceremonies. So Irwin actually attended an unveiling of a plaque at the stadium. So their major football or soccer stadium. There was a plaque that they unveiled and had installed, that honored the POWs in Fukuoka 14B, where his father was held. And so, that's going to get a lot of foot traffic being right at the stadium. The Japanese peace community, have worked really hard to get the government to acknowledge the hibakusha from abroad and recognize that, like, look, these 50,000 Koreans that died, these 60,000 Koreans that survived, they were prisoners, right? They were working in the Mitsubishi factory at Nagasaki and doing these things because of the Japanese militaristic regime. And that's another reason that there's such pride in Article 9, right? Because it's taking active steps to get away from this thing that brought so much harm. And there was a lot of educating about the nuclear legacy as well throughout the conference. But I would say the museums themselves, the peace museums, were a little different from each other. So Nagasaki's museum was a bit more scientifically focused and more interactive in a sense. And so I'd say it was good overall. But also the Hiroshima Museum was much more focused on the victims, and it was done in a very somber, solemn, moving way. And I thought, that was really powerful. But, in Nagasaki, it was a bit of a different feeling. So again, like you had buildings that were collapsed and iron bars and things in the room that were shown. So it was a bit more immersion, which again just was a different perspective. But I think, one thing that really stuck with me were these particular images of the various tests. So they had the globe, and within it, like little, I don't know exactly what they were. They were just like hard little balls that were stacked up to represent the number of nuclear tests that had happened. And obviously, over the years, some of them had fallen off. But for the most part, you can see like the US West and all the testing that we did. You can see the tests that Russia did throughout, including in Kazakhstan, the Marshall Islands and the Pacific and the places that we tested, right? And you can see these massive impacts in the circle and the radiation clouds that had spread from those. And so I thought that that was an interesting way to do the museum too. And I think like that will stick with people. And particularly when it came to testing, the museum in Hiroshima sort of just talked about it, and it was very like word heavy, read about the history of testing, versus in Nagasaki, it was like look at the history of testing. And so I thought that that was really impactful way to represent it. Um, and yeah, so I think the big takeaway, obviously, from the conference was that we really need to make nuclear disarmament urgent again. The nuclear threat has sort of receded from public consciousness since the end of the Cold War, but it's still around us, right? A Hibakusha survivor, Terumi Tanaka, when he was accepting the Peace Prize last year in his speech, reaffirmed that nuclear weapons cannot and must not coexist with humanity. So we have our work cut out for us, because the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists doomsday clock is closer to midnight than ever in its history at 89 seconds. We have 13,000 nuclear weapons still in arsenals worldwide, and plans in place to spend trillions upgrading them and making them deadlier than ever. President Trump's Golden Dome risks weaponizing space. International treaties and agreements are being abandoned, and deterrence is being glorified by many in power. And the voices of survivors are growing fainter, right? There's about 99,000 hibakusha left, and the average age is now at 86. So we're, sort of facing those last generations when these folks can firsthand tell their stories. But the power of people has always been mightier than the people in power. The UN TPNW serves as a path forward for increasing the global consensus that nuclear weapons must be banned. Grassroots campaigns like Back from the Brink, that I know you are all a part of, are shifting power to local communities when federal action fails. After decades of pressure, we finally saw wins for expanding compensation for Trinity test survivors, downwinders, and Marshall Islanders, which is a much needed acknowledgement of the harm that nuclear testing caused them. From banning nuclear tests to exposing government secrecy on fallout, we've successfully pushed back throughout our history, and we will continue to do so. We owe it to the Hibakusha. We owe it to the Downwinders, Marshall Islanders, and Kazakh communities that were poisoned by testing. And we owe it to every child born into a world still haunted by these weapons. So for peace, for justice, for the future, let's get to work.
Thank you so much, Lily. Wonderful. Really appreciate that little journey we got to take with you. And now we have plenty of time for Q&A and also discussion. I'm going to start with questions. I know, Jeffrey, you have a comment, and we will definitely get to that. I do have some clarifying questions that I want to pose to Lily first, including one that you have put in here, Jeffrey, which, let's see. Okay, Jeffrey is asking for you to clarify or correct if you know different, that Japan doesn't hold a candle to how Germany is making amends for what they did during World War II. but Japan still hasn't apologized to either Korea's or China for what they did. Do you know anything about and I know a lot of what you did was more with the people of Japan, not the government, but there's some crossover. So Lily, do you know anything about that?
So I think that they have apologized, and I'm not completely sure, what the statements were over the years, but there have been multiple statements issued and apologies issued. It's just, you know, put your money where your mouth is, right? So if you're issuing statements and you're not necessarily taking action to right those wrongs, that's a problem. And so there's still quite a bit of tension on this, and it's part of the reason that the peace communities and peace groups there make it such a priority to, right, push recognition for these victims. And over the years, we're seeing that pressure adding up. So there have been more attempts to normalize relations. So, obviously Abe was a bit more of a militaristic, hawkish, well, not really militaristic since they don't have a military officially, but like hawkish kind of president, or prime minister, whereas the recent one, I guess, has taken steps to make amends with China and Korea in particular, but better relations with Asian countries overall. So that's part of the reason that his resignation, is leaving things up in the air, because it's unknown who will step in and fill that role in the coming, you know, weeks, I guess, when they make those decisions. And so that'll obviously shape the direction that diplomatic relations with those countries continue to move in.
Okay, so I'm gonna have Colin Jeffrey so that we can make sure that answered his question. I hopefully got it right. And I know he also has a comment to make, a suggestion. So Jeffrey, you should be able to unmute now. Can you see if that worked? Go ahead.
If you read an article I've read, you should see how Germany is actually making amends for what it did during World War II. It's incredible. They're actually going out. People are actually going out of their way to right the wrongs that their country did during, even ordinary civilians. That's how I remember it. But you are right. But Japan still needs to make amends, because South Korea still doesn't hates Japan. So is China. And don't even get me started with North Korea. That was, but seriously, they need to make amends with them. We need, especially North Korea, since they have nuclear weapons, Japan's original nuclear weapons, because I think there was an article about that read Japan was working toward nuclear weapons, and I think North Korea had
Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons,
well
nor are they
they
working
were
toward
during
them.
World War II.
Right, but they have abandoned all of
I know, but
that
now
since. And you're
now
right, though, actions need to happen, right? And so that's what I was getting at. They've issued statements, but there's further steps that can be taken to make amends. And again, they are attempting to make those steps, but it's certainly a long way to go. One thing I learned as well was the monument to the South Korean victims. They are looking to expand some of the monuments and reshape them so that it's all Korean victims, right? Recognizing North and South Korea, because obviously there was prisoners from both, who were in Japan at the time.
Okay, we have some more questions, and we can circle back if you had another one, Jeffrey, but let me get Mike in next. We have plenty of time, so don't worry, we will get to everyone.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out with Japan and Germany that Germany really didn't do anything till the late 70s, early 80s. There was a Holocaust TV show at the same time that Roots came out in America that gave the Germans more of a conscience. And the trouble with Japan, the reason why they have not apologized to their own people for World War II or for keeping the war going to the point that the bombs were dropped, and they haven't really deeply apologized to either the Chinese or the South Koreans in such a way that would give them compensation. I mean, they do polite apologies, but they don't do deep apologies that are meaningful, is because they committed a lot of war crimes in the sense of the rape of Nanking, the Unit 731, which was doing human experimentations, and to open themselves to liability of trying to compensate everyone that they really did damage to. And of course, you still have unresolved conflicts between Taiwan and the mainland and North and South Korea. So from a Japanese point of view, they really don't want to open up that can of worms and really, cause a lot of, I don't know what it would be called, maybe confusion. So anyway.
Thanks for that, Mike. Did you have a question also, or okay? That's Siddhartha. Go ahead. I think you should. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I think everything that I've heard today is very thought-provoking, including the remarks by the last two speakers. Their observations about Germany are true. Germany certainly didn't become contrite right after the war ended. It took at least 20, 25 years, but a remarkable thing that I noticed when I went to Germany for a book that I've been writing. I asked in the various small towns that I visited, and I didn't go into the big cities. I wanted a sense of German culture at its roots. I asked them a simple question in German: Wo ist der jüdische Friedhof? Where's your Jewish cemetery? And every town that I asked that question in, people dropped what they were doing, escorted me to the cemetery, and wanted to learn more about my mission in Germany. I don't think Japan has approached that level of contrition at all. I don't know if it ever will, but I thought I'd make that comment about the Germans today, certainly not after the post-war period, but well into it. The other question which I would have is for the main speaker. I'm really curious, could you address the constituent parts of what bearing witness actually means in a substantial, meaningful way? What do we need to do to bear witness and to sustain our witness? Thank you.
Oof, that's a tricky question, I would say. It's great. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think I'm hoping I'm accomplishing some of that here today, right? What I got to witness firsthand in Japan, even being as plugged into these issues as I am through this work at Peace Action, was still just, floored me. There is something about seeing pictures versus being there, right? And hearing people's stories firsthand. I did not have the honor of speaking to Hibakusha in person, but I heard from some second and third generation Hibakusha, Japanese Hibakusha, who were there. Obviously hearing Erwin's stories about his father and some of the stories about testing. I think that those are things that we need to continue to bear witness about as well. There's people are more familiar with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Like people know those names, but the impact of nuclear weapons goes beyond just that. And I think that that was one thing the community was able to show me as well, and this conference was able to show me that this is ongoing, right? Like there were tests in Russia happening into the 90s, right? And like, thank goodness we got the nuclear test ban treaty put in place. Obviously, North Korea is violating that. Other places are doing what they will, but for the most part, that globe that I saw, right, with all the major tests happening, that's something that's has stopped, right? And now we need to make right and acknowledge the harm. And I think it's interesting, right? Like we're talking about Japan acknowledging what it did to China, South Korea making amends, Germany, et cetera. What about the United States? Right? What have the Marshall Islanders really gotten from us? They're stuck eating canned food that's overpriced. They are dependent and really stuck in this almost colonialist sort of position within this country because of the nuclear legacy that we put in place there, right? The downwinder community that has cancer rates 10, 20 times higher than anything else, right? Yeah, exactly. The US has never apologized for dropping nuclear bombs. So it's easy enough to point the finger at what these other countries need to do. When we're not leading by example, though, I feel like that's one step that we as a peace community here at home need to be doing, right? The Japanese peace community is doing their part to try to force their government to acknowledge this. And I thought it was interesting. Our host mentioned the Japanese people, for the most part, blame their own government and the imperialistic, militaristic government for what happened, not the United States, right? And so he said overwhelmingly, again, I might just be in a bubble and it might be his community that believes this, not a majority of people. I need to look into that. But I can believe it because there really is this understanding that it was the militarism and the drive for war that caused all of this. And so I think, you know, bearing witness means recognizing all of that, but also looking at ourselves and figuring out how we can keep the work going and how we can continue to make progress and continue to put this in the public awareness because the threat isn't over just because the Cold War ended.
I have a question for you from Will Thomas. Has the U.S. encouraged Japan to abandon Article 9 in order to counter China and North Korea? And you might want to say a little bit about what Article 9 is.
Yeah, so that I mentioned it earlier. I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but it's their renunciation of war clause of the Constitution. So Japan doesn't actually have a military in place. It disbanded any sort of military. They have a small self-defense force, which, mobilizes during national disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, those kinds of things, and has been navigating some of the spats on their islands in the South China Sea and things like that, but it's not an actual military. There is very wide public support for Article 9, so I don't think a government can just undo it, right? With any amount of pressure, it would just not be politically wise. So no, the US is not. The Article 9 is still very much in place. The US that I know of hasn't even really asked, but who knows what's being said behind closed doors. Perhaps there's some pressure. But it's popular enough for the time that I don't foresee that being an issue.
Thanks, Lily. We have more questions, and at this point, let's see what we can do. I do want Jeffrey to get to. I guess he did not get to finish before. So Jeffrey, if you can try to be concise so we can get to some other folks' questions, that would be great. Go ahead.
All right. Picture this. I think this would be a good way to raise awareness for the anti-nuclear weapons awareness, it making a feature film about it with a very strong message. The story of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, both from the US perspective and the Japanese perspective. I think from the Japanese perspective, I think you'll see the horrors of the nuclear bombs right from the ground level that they did. What I mean? You think doing that could actually making two feature films like that, like Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, like that kind of thing, and actually help raise awareness for the anti-nuclear weapons cause.
Yeah, I just put in the chat list of some really good, strong films. And they were spotlighted in the museums as well. They were like on sale in most of the places.
But are they feature films is what I'm asking. I think that because I thought they would be a better than documentaries, if
Yeah.
you know what I mean, since that was my main idea I wanted to propose. I thought, you know, that that really that by proposing this idea we can actually help out more.
Well, yeah, sounds good. And if anyone has any connections to folks who can make something like that happen, for sure, that would be great. I mean, we have had some films such as Oppenheimer that have certainly raised the issue, whether they were exactly anti-nuclear, at least they opened up the conversations and people did take advantage of that. I know a lot of groups had showings and such. So yeah, anywhere we can use arts and culture to keep the conversation going seems like that is a positive step. We don't have much time here, and there was a question that we hadn't heard from Moji tonight, and he has a philosophical question that I'll put out to you. To what extent do you think that normalizing nuclear weapons, especially through deterrence, is a form of normalizing evil, as pointed out by Holocaust survivor philosopher Hannah Arendt? And I actually wanted to mention before hearing from you, Lily, that I was on a Zoom that National Peace Action and some other groups put together called, I think, Debunking Deterrence, which was really fabulous and is still online. And maybe we can get that info to people, because it really made a strong case that what we're calling deterrence is actually just another facet of the arms race that we're creating. That what we say, oh, this looks like deterrence, other countries experience as aggression or threat. So anyway, Lily, but
Yeah.
hopefully you caught Moji's question before I kind of went on another direction.
No, I was actually going to suggest redirecting to that resource. They can speak to it far better than I can. There's just so much there around debunking that. And I think, one thing that brings to mind is sort of the recent Department of War executive order. I actually see that as an opportunity for us. I have always thought the Department of Defense was the smartest rebrand that the Department of War could have made, because who wants to not have defense, right? We need to be defended. It's just like such a word that triggers fear and provokes this sort of innate, like, oh yeah, we need defense. Whereas, yeah, no, call it what it is. It's a Department of War. It's offensive. It is aggressive. It is straying from the diplomacy we need in order to truly resolve conflicts. And so I think deterrence is exactly the same. Yes, balance of terror. Exactly. So that presentation, I think, was really impactful in tearing away some of the narrative around deterrence that, I think parts of the world understand, right? We are seeing the TPNW being ratified by a majority of the world. So they get it. They get it. Now we just need to get there.
And I mean, I think we can really see, and I do need to wrap up here, how we feel. I mean, we're completely freaked out by the idea that Iran might have one nuclear weapon, which, as far as they're concerned, is deterrence. And who could blame them, given what's happened to countries around them without nuclear weapons? But we don't see it that way. To us, it is an existential threat for them to get one. So why would we think others wouldn't look at our massive arsenal and feel threatened by that? So there's something very strange in our sort of, I'm not even sure if it's a double standard, but our framing of this issue that really shows we don't seem to understand how other people are experiencing what we do in the world. And in a way, that's not a bad thing, because it shows that people in the world, if we understood others better, I think the paths to peace would be so much clearer. It's not as impossible as we're told that it is. we are all human beings. And if we could understand each other more deeply and wanted to, I think many, many openings would appear, and it would not be as impossible as a lot of people make it out to be right now. I do need to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank Lilly so much for going to this conference and bringing us back a little look into what happened and how, you know, I appreciated hearing that so much of the world watched these ceremonies, because I don't think it was on the TV in the US, you know, but to understand that, you know, so many other people get it. So many other people are working on this. We feel alone in the US sometimes, but we're really not. And that, I think, is a really beautiful thing to be reminded of, and really can help fuel us as we continue this work that is so critical, but not super easy. I have a few wrap-up announcements and such to share with you all. Did I put in the chat? Did it take yet? Again, want to tell folks tonight was co-sponsored by 3 organizations: New Hampshire Peace Action, Peace Action Maine, and National Peace Action. And the links are in the chat to find out more and keep up with all of us. The series is free, or this tonight and many of our programs on Zoom are free and open to everyone. That said, we appreciate your donations. nhpeaceaction.org/donate is our page. And if you check out those links to the other groups, I'm sure you can easily find ways to contribute. I do want to note that next week there is a Block the Bombs webinar that National is putting together that features Delia Ramirez, right? Am I right, Lilly? Thank you. I wanted to make sure I got that right. So there's a link in the chat for that. I'm going to mention a few other events that New Hampshire Peace Action has coming up. We have Ceasefire Now vigils next week, September 17th, Wednesday, 2 to 3 at Senator Shaheen's Dover office. Then Thursday, September 18th, noon to 1 at City Plaza in Concord. Those are our ceasefire vigils. And then more general programming, we have quite a few things. Let's see, Tuesday, September 16th at 6:30 p.m., Miko